Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Generations, Artistic Expressions of Heritage and Identity with the phenomenal artist, Helina Metaferia. My name is Ginevra Morse, Vice President of Education and Programming at American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center, and we are happy to be partnering with the Museum of Fine Arts Boston for this special event. Now, the family and community that precede us shape how we see the world today, from pride in identity to the effects of suffering across generations and the desire to imagine better futures. How do we process the memories and experiences we inherit? Today, interdisciplinary and research-based artist Helina Metaferia will discuss her most recent exhibition at the MFA Boston, Helina Metaferia Generations, which explores how we carry on the legacies of our elders, the kinship we find in our contemporaries, and the many ways these relationships inform and shape us. If we go to the next slide, you'll see our moderator for today. So moderating a conversation with the artist is Michelle Millar Fisher. Michelle is currently the Ronald C and Anita L Wornick Curator of Contemporary Decorative Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. Her work focuses on the intersections of people, power, and the material world. At the MFA, she is working on her next book, tentatively titled Craft Schools, Where We Make What We Inherit. And she is a part of an independent team of collaborators working on a book, exhibition, curriculum, and program series called Designing Motherhood, Things That Make and Break Our Births. She is currently completing her doctorate in art history at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Michelle will be in conversation with Helina Metaferia, after which we'll take questions from the audience. So at any point during the presentation, feel free to type your questions into the panel at the bottom of your screen. We are recording this event, and starting tomorrow, you can freely go back and review any of the content from the presentation on our website, as well as our YouTube channel. All right, so without further ado, I will now turn things over to Michelle, who will introduce Helina.
Thank you so very much, Ginevra, Courtney, everybody at the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and of course, everyone gathered here as the audience this afternoon. It's my deep pleasure to introduce Helina, who I've now known for about 2.5 years after a really wonderful studio visit in 2019. As Ginevra noted, Helina's work is currently on display at the MFA in Boston in an exhibition that I was lucky enough to curate there. You're going to learn a lot about Helina's bio and the sort of impetus for her work over the last decade or two when we talk, but I'll give a very brief bio here. She's an interdisciplinary artist working across performance, video, installation, collage, and social engagement. And her work really centers on telling overlooked stories that really focus on Black bodies in positions of power and vulnerability, informed by written and oral archives, dialogical art, and somatic experiences. She received her MFA from Tufts University School of the Museum of Fine Arts, and so just across the road from the MFA Boston. She also has had many really fantastic awards and fellowships. She attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and she's currently an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow and Assistant Professor at Brown University. So she splits her time between Providence and New York. So I'm so delighted to welcome Helina today, and she's going to begin just now with a practice of calling in ancestors, especially her mom, as a way to open our conversation. I will kick off with some questions. We'll look at some images together for about 35 or 40 minutes, and we warmly welcome your questions either in the chat throughout our conversation or certainly in the time that we have after it. So Helina, welcome. It's so nice to have you here.
Hello. Can you see me? I'm not sure if my video came on. Okay.
Perfectly.
Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Helina Metaferia. I am an interdisciplinary artist. And a big part of my practice that I do in community is thinking about generations of the past and how it affects our current contemporary moment. Hence the title Generations for the MFA show. I'm thinking a lot about ancestry, and I'm also thinking about genealogy, our own but shared and collective histories. And I wanted to start today by acknowledging all of us that are in the room, that even though I can't see you, I can feel you. But I want us to also acknowledge those who've come before us. So if everyone can just take a minute to think of an ancestor, either related to you and of your bloodline, or a person who's come before who may no longer be here, who has been an inspiration to you. Think of and identify one that you want to bring into the room with us, this virtual room that we're in. And for me, that's my mother, my Ganet Shafarao, who passed away in 2016 on February 24th. But I'm still very much connected to and very motivated by in my art and in my life. And so I bring her in, and I just want you to take a moment to think about the effect that this person may have had, either through their work, through some words they may have shared, through an example they may have left. And with that, I think we can begin.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helina. So I want to begin with this image here. So this is a gallery at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and this is about 7 years ago. This is actually the same gallery that your exhibition is in just now, so there's this beautiful circularity to it. But can you talk a little bit about what we're looking at here and what it meant to you to be in this space at this moment in time?
Yes, so this was called Ancestral Honoring. It was actually created while I was a graduate school student at the School of Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I was invited by Curator Liz Mansell to do this performance in front of a live audience. I believe it was 2015. And I was wearing a wearable sculpture, as I call it, made out of reproductions of family photographs. And so I worked intrinsically with my mother a year before she passed on this project to source family photographs. We looked through albums. She had really shared with me a lot of my own family tree and my oral history of how my family, who's Ethiopian American, how they were and how they grew up in Ethiopia, and her own trajectory coming to the US in the 60s, 69. My dad came in 73. And so also in this wearable sculpture is maps of Washington, D.C. and Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So the city in which I was born in the US, one capital, and then the capital in which my mother had lived and my father had studied, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And so I was thinking about this transnational new American story. And so I embodied that through this embodied archive. I had literally these archives on my body. And then through gestures, I did a different walk for a different ancestor by marking the canvas that was on the ground with a liquid. I used a hibiscus juice to kind of be reminiscent of blood. And then my footprints became this installation that formed over time. And so what the audience witnessed is the vulnerability of this very personal ritualistic action done in a public domain with the accountability of a public, so that maybe that they can start to think about their own American history, their own American story, and how they, known or unknown, have come to be here.
So you were very literally in this moment, sort of wearing your family history on your body, Helina. What was it like, that conversation with your mom when you were creating the garment that you wore for this particular performance? Did she understand how it was going to be used? Did she understand what you were doing as an artist? How did that conversation go? What was that process like, looking back to those family photos?
Yeah, my parents are not artists. My mother was an Ethiopian women's rights activist and an educator. My father teaches political science, and they don't really have the creative, know-how of like something that's very conceptual, like performance art. So when I was studying performance art, there was a bit of explaining, but I do feel that what she knew was that I was curious about her and our family, and that's something we could share and bond over, right? So even though the medium or the exact, like the art form itself wasn't something that was like, readily understood by her, I think this curiosity to dive deep and to dig into, where I'm from, where she's from, but also what that means in our current moment. Right. So, this idea of becoming a new American as a Black person in this country makes me think a lot about the relationship to how a Black person can be here voluntarily, right? And knowing that this is a country that houses the histories of a transatlantic slave trade. And so I think that this new wave of immigration was something that she also felt very much connected to, having come to this country a year after MLK got killed, right? So in the civil rights moment, the height of the civil rights moment. So as a very aware, self-aware person, I think she was interested in that aspect of the project.
And performance has very definitely remained really central to your practice. They've got a slide here and another one just coming up. Can you talk us through what we're looking at here?
Yeah. So a year later, like as I said, she passed, and I had just finished my graduate program, and I was very like all over the place, feeling the grief of the loss, and feeling quite young to have lost my mother. And so I wanted to connect to her, and it made a lot of sense for me to do it through my art, because my art, like many artists, is a place to reconcile with the personal, the social, the global, everything that is life, right? And so I made sense of it through art. And so she was in the middle of writing a memoir about her activism work as an expat Ethiopian woman, fighting on behalf of Ethiopian political prisoners, et cetera. And so my father and I hacked into her email, found this unfinished memoir, and since then it's been published, thank goodness, especially with the help of my father. But what I did is I laid out printouts of that memoir and buried it essentially in sand. And slowly, over about a 30-minute period, I dug through that sand and recited passages and basically channeled that voice that I had missed. And it was a mixture of this personal, delicate, revealing moments, and many who have lost a loved one could identify on that just very human scale. But then there were this text that was incredibly political, that was incredibly much about mark making of a different kind, mark making in terms of leaving action, leaving history, leaving a contribution to society, right? So I was marking the ground with this sort of flower shape based on my gestures, and a little bit of that spilt hibiscus again, and so, but then there was also like thinking about how she left her mark.
And then you've definitely done these performances in museum spaces and gallery spaces and institutional spaces, but can you tell us what we're looking at just here?
Well, I'm interested in many forms of lineage. So there's the ancestral, and I think as an artist, it's always great to start with self. And I think a part of that is because it's quite accessible, starting with your own body and your own story, but it's also an introspection that I think is really important to make the work that you're supposed to make in the world, to make something that's that has some substance. And then from there, I move into the political lineages and artistic lineages and other forms of lineages that I've inherited. And thinking about a political lineage, on the 100th anniversary of a white woman's right to vote in this country on August 18th, I did this performance in Brooklyn. Because of the pandemic, it was outdoors, so quite different. And it was in community with the Wide Awakes, which I'm sure we'll discuss at some point. On this anniversary, I did an honoring for Black women suffragettes who had not received the same right to vote until about 40 years later. And so I thought about, Ida B. Wells and like all of these amazing historic figures by calling their name, printing out and showing a photograph, doing an honoring that was devotional, but at the same time, there was an element of celebration. There was a singer that I collaborated with who I had not known before. We had met that day, and I had given her a score to interpret, Chanel Johns. She did an amazing job. So what I was doing with movement, she was doing with sound. And there was this call and response, which was really, if you were just visiting the park, you kind of wanted to see what was going to happen next.
So we will definitely come back to the Wide Awakes, because I'd love to talk a little bit more about that as sort of an artistic lineage, an artistic community, or creating a family in some sense. We're looking here, though, at your current exhibition up at the MFA, and we're definitely in community with an audience this afternoon that does a lot of mining archives to find family connections. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the centrality of archive to your work, and we'll look at a few more slides as we sort of move through this question, because there are many many ways in which that takes shape. But can you talk about, archives and their centrality to what you do, and maybe, some of the earliest archives you ever took a look at and dove into as an artist?
Well, in this particular exhibition, I'm looking particularly at archives in 4 forms. So there are physical documents that people have created, and then it was somehow gathered and stored in a repository, such as a library specifically. I'm also looking at oral history as a form of knowledge sharing, and a way that we pass down legacy and story through just sound and word of mouth. I'm also looking at crowdsourced archive, so creating an archive and building that from participatory installation. And then I'm also looking at an embodied knowledge. So I do these workshops, which we'll get into, where I was working with different groups. I was working with students and faculty and staff in 4 Boston colleges to make this particular show: Tufts University, Northeastern, Emerson, and Mass Art. And through these embodied workshops, we thought about epigenetics and what gets stored in our DNA in terms of memory, and how trauma can get passed on through the body, but also joy. And there's other forms of information that are inherent in our genealogy. And so activating that through performance and performance exercises was part of that project. So investigating all those different forms for me felt really crucial. One might look at my work and say, well, you must source from the internet if they're looking at my collages, or looking at public things that are easily in the public domain. And I actually spend a lot of time, I don't really source from the internet. I don't source much at all from the internet. I spend a lot of time in collaboration, really. So a lot of my collaboration comes with either people that are wanting to participate in the work, or librarians who are bestowed with this task to house and to archive and to make sure that this information that comes within their collection gets preserved. So yeah.
So I want to talk about one of those forms of sort of archival deep dives in a way. So we're going to look at the next slide, which is this work here, or part of this work here. And this is very much part of oral history, being able to listen as people share family stories and ancestries. It's a work called The Call, which is a video work that you created. It's about 17 minutes long. It really captivates viewers. I find people in that gallery all of the time, which is a rare thing in a museum, where people often pass by things very quickly. But it's a mix of spoken and sung testimony. Can you talk a little bit about the content of this work, Helina, and B, why you made it, how it sort of factors into this notion of archives and familial lineage?
Yes, I'm so glad people are watching and listening. As when an artist leaves the exhibition, we don't always know what happens when we're gone after we've installed it. This is actually a really near and dear piece to me. It was a project created with the participation of 4 descendants of prominent male civil rights leaders. On the left is Melanie and Ashira Douglas, who are Frederick Douglass's descendants. In the middle is Ayanna Gregory, who is Dick Gregory's daughter. And on the right is James Baldwin's sister, Ms. Paula Whaley. And through their agreement, we all met together for a day of story sharing, a performance, so to speak, but also mostly, doing what I find very familiar is those living room conversations where you receive a lot of information from, an auntie or, someone that is akin, and doing that with this blend of different families felt, I felt very privileged to be able to be the nurturer and the caretaker of those stories. So I made this film, which ended up being about a 17-minute edit from this day together. And some of it's done, as you can see in this still here, at Fells Point, which is in Baltimore, Maryland, which is one of the oldest slave ports in the country. And this is sort of a performative gesture where they release these flowers into the port, into the water. And then the other part of it is done in conversation where they talk about the matriarchs and their family who were not as documented, but were instrumental in the civil rights movement and how they played roles. I'm looking at the overlooked stories of women within activist histories. So much of the documentation I found in these archives as I'm working in libraries, et cetera, in movements that were either predominantly or, or generously led by women, that labor that they contributed has not always been cited and credited. And some of that will never be, because it wasn't considered actual work, right? Like the emotional labor or the labor to caretake. So I'm really interested in uncovering those sorts of stories. They also talked about their vision for the present day as 4 amazing creatives in themselves. Each one of them brought an artistic form. Some sang, some did poetry, some offered their sculptures. And it was really, to me, when you can talk about difficult subject matter like, disparity and some of the issues that we're seeing right now with Black Lives Matter, et cetera, it's very easy for it to get gloomy. But what I pride myself in my work, at least that I try, is that I really try to bring a sense of upliftment. And I hope that I feel like the participants feel that way too.
So we have this work and then another work called The Woke in the exhibition at the MFA. And you talked about another form of sort of archival work or looking at history as crowdsourcing, listening, and sort of inviting people in to trace history by making history, by putting the words to history themselves. And so can you talk a little bit about what the work is, again, the woke as a work itself, and how it fits into this sort of larger practice of archival work?
So one project for me always blends into the next, and I love when exhibitions can speak to each other. So I've been invited to do solo exhibitions around the country for the last several years, and at least for the last 4 years, I've incorporated some aspect of this particular installation called The Woke, where I crowdsource, or I ask participants, gallery goers, people that are coming into the space to contribute answers on a note card. Sometimes those questions are made by people from the community. So students will make up some of the questions about things that they're interested in. The most popular question is, what is your everyday revolution? So that's something that's always getting asked. What would you be able to do on a micro or macro level to inspire change? Either personal change, social change, or global change. And I think we are in agreement. Most people, if not all people, want some kind of change to happen. No one is usually very satisfied with things just as they are. Our problem is we cannot really agree as to what the change is. So this is a way for me to, I've done this installation in Alabama, at Auburn University, at Northeastern University, in Boston, at Michigan State University. So it's a way for people to sort of have these kind of more difficult, nuanced conversations. And on the next slide, you can see how it unfolds. So at the MFA, I did one iteration, and there's been a few iterations where I'll either make them on buttons, the responses, and people can take someone's thoughts in exchange for somebody else's thoughts. At the MFA, there are these protest signs with some of the selected responses. I worked to work with typography that was reminiscent of the 1960s civil rights movement, and thinking about black, white, and also shades of gray as a color palette because of the nuance of some of these conversations. These aren't just black and white conversations. There's a lot of shades of gray here. People can, at the museum, can scan on a URL, scan a URL code, and they can receive a link to fill out and contribute. Again, I've got some really great responses so far from the MFA participants, and then which will get into future iterations of the Woke. So I imagine this continuing throughout the country and maybe internationally. And in exchange, they can download some of the protest signs. So what's really fun for me is how the people use the ephemera that I volunteering I give. One of the fun ways that recently happened, Michelle, would you like to speak a little bit about this?
So as folks in Boston and perhaps beyond might know, the MFA, the staff of which I'm a part, recently voted to unionize, and Helina's show actually opened about a week before there was a strike by staff, which was attended by the union members. And many folks who were at the strike brought their own posters, and many of them downloaded the poster from the QR code in this exhibition. A popular one was that one right in the middle, make change, make waves. And so a lot of your posters were taken out on the street outside the MFA at the same time, which I thought was incredibly powerful, because so often we talk in cultural organizations about connecting with the issues of the day, be they social, economic, political, artistic, a mixture of all of those things. But often that is done in maybe a word or intention, but maybe not always impact. Here, there was a very direct line between the ways in which you are mining histories of activism and the present day activism that was happening in part just outside the museum that day. So it was a really interesting and very profound activation of this particular part of the exhibition. I love this work, and I feel like it's incredibly impactful when folks come into the space. The other thing that people are really blown away by are these life-size collages. So it's difficult to see the scale in this particular image, but if you imagine these as 8-foot frames with almost 5 or 6 foot figures in them, and then crowned in this way. Helina, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about these works, and we'll look at some detailed images of collage as well. You know, collage is very central to your practice, so maybe thinking about that as a method, the collage, the images that you use, and why you've created this particular series.
Right. So as an interdisciplinary artist, I'm always thinking about what's the best medium that can get at the subject matter that I'm interested in. I started my trajectory in art as an undergraduate student, as a painter, and I worked very faithfully in painting. And I felt at some point I couldn't get paint to do everything that I wanted it to do. I couldn't get it to scream and shout, so I went into performance. I couldn't get it to help me build community in the ways of an organizer, so I went into social practice. And for me, I'm really interested in this ready-made, this pre-made content that through my hand can get re-altered, reconfigured in a way where it becomes layered and turns into a new meaning. So I spent quite a bit of time in deep research. I've done this in different libraries around the country, but for this particular show, spending time with Harvard University Library and Northeastern University Library, which both have special collections in activism local to Boston. And so I spent time with those repositories, working closely with a research assistant who really helped to get that very intense bibliography that's also on view right now at the MFA. So you can find exactly which sources and what bins all of these collage works are in. But as I mentioned earlier, I work with participants in these performance workshops. So the first part of this was a performance workshop that occurred last March 2021 with these 4 colleges, bringing in students and faculty and staff who identify as BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, who identify as women, so that's cis and transgender. And in this private space, which I tried to create a safe space, this like really vulnerable moments of sharing, we went through performance and somatic movements that can restore peace in the body or to release stress and trauma in the body that mimic or look like activism. So there's a very much shared history between activist gestures and performance art. They sometimes look exactly the same. If not, they are the same, one and the same. Both use a lot of the spectacle and sort of this sort of like call to attention in order, and they have some sort of agenda. And so specifically with activism, as we know, it's to encourage policy. It's how a lot of change has been made in this country. It is how we are currently seeing change. And so all of this was taking place. And Michelle and I have been in conversation prior to the uprisings of 2020. This show was supposed to happen in 2020, and we had been in conversations since 2019. I think the timeliness of the moment, having done this workshop in 2021 and the exhibition also coming up in 2021, is that more people were more receptive and there was more of a need for a collective healing. But I've been making this series since 2018. All of my work has been about institutional critique since way longer than that. So there's artists who just always been doing that work. And then sometimes there's this really pivotal moment where people are more receptive. And that's when this little opening happens. And then you're thinking, I can have the conversations that I really wanted to have because more people are ready. And they too see the value. So anyway, I say all that to say 3 of these participants were selected for these collages. I adorn them with these images of other, which is really hard to see. Maybe we can go to another slide. Anyway, it's also kind of hard to see here, but there's a lot of activist history happening within all of my collage work. Sometimes I work bust size. Some these are like other collages for other shows, but sometimes I work bust size, which is like head up. But they're always printed to scale, and they're always printed with sort of this intricacy. In addition to working with students, faculty, and staff, some of these that you're seeing right now are actual people on the front lines of activism, people that are part of the BLM movement or other activist communities, including the Wide Awakes, which I'm also part of, around the country. And so it's been a nice mix. I worked with 3 of the BLM founders and chapter leaders. And well, actually I worked with a couple of them, and I feel like I think that that's been really great to see, that especially now that these pieces are getting collected in institutions, that there is some sort of new record of activism now, that yes, women have always been here in activist history, and now at least we can start to document the labor that they're doing and then the impact they're having in changing our countries and our systems to be more equitable, right? Like this is something that I think benefits all of us. So anyway, I hope I answered some of your question. I feel like I'm going on tangents.
You absolutely did. And you mentioned again, I think it's really worth bringing up now, talking about the Wide Awakes and talking about some of the conversations. I mean, I know we looked at some of your performance work that has been done right out there on the street, in the open, in the cityscape. But if you could talk a little bit more about what the Wide Awakes are and how they've sort of become a chosen family in a way in terms of art practice. And we'll look a little bit, I know we're coming closer to a time when we might take some questions, but I think we have time to talk a little bit about both the Wide Awakes and some of the kind of public art that you have done over the last year or 2.
Yeah. So the Wide Awakes community is a group of artists, activists, but really people from all fields and backgrounds. It's totally open source, so anyone can join. And they're modeled after the original Wide Awakes, which is some of you may know, an 1860s abolitionist movement, where there was a lot of white men in capes trying to get President Lincoln elected. That was their main objective. And of course, with that, to abolish slavery. And so in 2019, the artist Hank Willis Thomas and looked towards his community, a group of people, including artists Jose Parla and Eric Gottsman and the For Freedom family, and started to think, what if we could do that again, wear capes and protest? And at that time, this was in response to the Trump election. But really, it was about encouraging voting in all regards, on all issues, local, state, federal, etc. And I fell in love with this community because it was a way that, the art world can feel very insular and very pretentious, but I felt very much the opposite. I felt the joy in which one of the premise is to organize through joy and to make it fun and festive. And that's something we've done. And through performance, through organizing work, through encouraging legislative, encouraging people to become more aware about choices and actions that we can take to shift. And so this is a community that's sprung up all over the world. There's chapters all over the world. And you can learn more on the website, Wide Awakes. I think it's wideawakes.com, I want to say. And there's also an active Instagram.
And so this is but one of the public installations that you've been very active in over the last couple of years, Helina. I love these particular installations that you did for Open Arts. Can you talk a little bit about them? I think we've got a couple of images of them, really large, much larger than life-size murals in New York City.
Yeah, so one thing I was trying to reconcile with is that, a lot of protest happens in public. It doesn't always happen in institutional space. And as an artist, I've been showing a lot in galleries and museums and academic institutional spaces, academic galleries and with academic communities. And so I wanted to reconcile that. And for me, public art does that. So there's been some 40-foot tall reproductions of my collage work as vinyl murals. This exists at Dream Yard in the Bronx. which is an arts organization, and the other one exists at Mokata, which is a museum in Brooklyn, at their new sculpture garden in downtown Brooklyn. And so you can see the work there. The next slide is another partnership that I did with Four Freedoms, and this is my most recent one in Los Angeles, in South Los Angeles, of 3 LA activists that I would happen to be able to do some work with. Kavan Ward, who's working with Justice for Brewster's Beach, Opal Tometi, who's one of the BLM founders, and Autumn Briam, who's one of the Wide Awakes. And next in what I will be doing next is this summer, I have another commissioned project with RISD Museum, where I'm working as a faculty of Brown. I did some workshops with Brown and RISD students, and the same sort of socially engaged, sort of looking at performance as protest, and I photographed them. And so now I'm working very closely with library archives at both institutions, creating a new repository data, archive system, and there will be a public art project with them as well. Also one in the Bronx with Pro Arts. So it's been really great for me. It's also been a way to get people just every day on the street involved in seeing my work, people who wouldn't pay $25 to go to a museum, or who don't think that art is for them. I've gotten great emails and DMs on Instagram and all kinds of other things where people tell me that it just brightens up their day and they feel seen and heard. They've had a bad day when they see other Black women sort of elevated in this way.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more, and we may sort of after a first round of questions about the way in which you conduct these workshops that are so central to your practice. I know we've got just a couple of minutes before we open for the first round of questions, and I warmly welcome anybody who is thinking about asking a question to send them in through Q&A, and we will definitely get to them. I'm going to ask one more question though before we get there. Can you tell us a little bit more about your own family, and very specifically your mom and dad, Helina? Because when we first met in a studio visit in 2019, your mom had just passed, my mom had too. And so we talked a lot about many, many things during that visit. It was sort of a highlight of a studio visit for me. But you talked about the centrality of your parents to really thinking about not just the content of your practice or the impetus for your practice, but thinking very specifically about what we inherit and how we carry on things from our family, what we don't carry on, what we take in a different direction. And so I'm wondering if you can talk just a little bit about sort of that personal background and the ways in which that really has informed and shaped your work as an artist.
Yeah, I love, like, now that I have a little bit more distance from like my childhood. That's another way to say I'm getting older, but I love how, like, when I was really young, I can look back and say like, oh, I want to be nothing like my parents. I'm going to do something totally different. I'm going to do art and just be this art person and just totally like travel and like see the world and do this other thing. And lo and behold, a lot of they both had PhDs. They were both researchers. My dad worked at HBCU. My mother, as I said before, she did a lot of voluntary work with an arts organization, but she was also an educator. And their research interests became like, I was like, wait, as I'm making my art, I'm like, am I doing the things? Like my dad was very politically involved as well. And my mother focused a lot on women's rights issues. And I was always, since a young age, when I was making art, it was always something that had like a social conscious twist to it. Even when I was in middle school painting, it was like these images of women with really big loads on their backs. Like I just always had this Ethiopian women big loads on their backs. I would see that when I was young visiting my grandmother in Ethiopia. They would always carry these beautiful things on their heads, like these baskets on their heads. What am I doing now? I mean, I'm doing the same kind of thing. This heavy load now is like, I think I'm making the same story since I was like 9 years old, really. I'm just have more tools and maturity and language to talk about my art. But yeah, I just can't escape. And it's not even that I would want to escape, because now as I have some distance, as I'm getting older, I realize I want to connect, because this is what I have to pass down to those who come after me. This is what I also have, for a connection when things are really tough and challenging. This is what I look at to give me strength, because not just my own family history, but I know that if I'm having a really bad day, I'm like, it must have been really hard in 1933 when my grandmother was in Ethiopia and doing X. I would think like, I got this, it's fine, right? It was a different time. So yeah, I mean, I think those things have inspired me as an artist, but also as a person.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that we are at a time where we might take some questions. And so, Ginevra, if there are some questions that you would like to pitch in, please do. Or if it's, we do have more slides if you'd like us to continue.
Well, I think we do have some questions if we want to pause here, and if you can stop sharing, but if maybe during the question, if some of those additional slides make sense, you can pop them back up on the screen. So we did get a few questions, especially as people were registering for the program. And one question, and I think, Helina, you've demonstrated this a bit already, but someone asks, how can oral history inform art or vice versa? And I'm especially interested in the vice versa. I mean, can art inform oral history?
That's a really good question. I think all artists are looking for material, and we're all looking for, we all want to make an impact in some way. It could be on a very local level. It could be, we don't want to make art and have it go unseen, right? At least professional artists, people who want to make art for like a hobby, maybe not so much, but if you're working, and part of our job is to sort of make sure that the world can benefit from the cultural production. So, I mean, if we can, I mean, my greatest hope is that my work can inspire another generation of artists or another just group of people. And so if I could inspire oral history, or my favorite form of documentation of my art is actually word of mouth. That means that it's good. So if people like leave this call and are like, oh, I heard about this one girl, and they tell somebody, that's a form of oral history, and that's a form of sharing. And then, the other thing that I really want to impact and that I measure my work, and so is in terms of memory, like how long it can sit in your memory. How long will people remember my performances beyond a camera, documenting it and saying that it was here and that it was present? Will someone think about it 5 years from now? Will somebody think about it a month from now, right? Like, I just love that, like, sort of, that to me is, I mean, whether it's good or bad doesn't matter to me. It's like more so, has it gotten you to rethink some aspect of life, or some aspect of what you think you know, right?
Mm.
I think that's very true when we have folks come into this space and into other galleries of the museum where there is a real affinity with what they see on display. Art does then impact oral history. There have been countless times in this exhibition and in others where folks have seen something, sometimes someone that looks like them or has an experience that connects to their own. And that just opens up their possibility to bring their own experiences to that moment and to tell their own stories. I think about that too in a project that Helina was also an amazing part of, Designing Motherhood. We looked at a lot of different oral histories in that project, people telling stories of the births that they had experienced, loss that they'd experienced, different medical experiences that they'd had. And I think seeing these oral histories in spaces of culture, sometimes in the form of a portrait, sometimes in the form of an object that is imbued with that kind of material culture memory, really does allow, as the great question sort of thought about, not just oral history to inform art or some kind of visual experience, but for that visual experience to legitimize and unlock folks to share oral histories that are often ones that are not thought to be, worthy of being in certain cultural spaces, organizations, or museums. So that for me is one of the most powerful things that work like yours can do, Helina.
Jessica says, I love that you mentioned the perspective shift that ancestry or history can offer. What's the main perspective shift that you hope viewers take away from your work?
Well, I mean, I think that's a good question. I think, putting up BIPOC women in a predominantly white dead male collecting museum, it's not, I think on some level there's a surface like, oh, this is an interesting collage, whatever, but it's not to go unsaid that it's 2022 and the ways museums, who they choose to exhibit, who they choose to acquire, who they, and how that drives, people in to come in. Like, I think that story, the MFA is still a very conservative institution. And I think that I don't think it goes unnoticed that there are Black women on the walls, and all of the activism history that allowed them to be there. It's for me to be here to make this kind of work, to have the legal right, to have the sort of ability to speak my voice. Like, those things should not go unnoticed. And I think that people get that when they see the work. I feel like they get, and then the fact that the work also has voice, it has story sharing with the video. You can hear it from all aspects of the exhibition. I think that, hearing someone's stories, there's a lot of power for that. I think people are, institutions and stories, it can kind of feel redundant, like, oh, let's hear someone's story, but I do think that in a world where we're competing against media, like, and hyper attention towards technology, and people don't sit down and really listen. We scroll really quickly, and we look at video, like 15 seconds for TikTok, and like all of these sorts of things. Like, to watch a 17-minute video of story sharing, I think it's not lost upon me that that's still very valuable and necessary.
Wesley asks an interesting question. What art would your grandmother have created about her heritage and life?
Oh my gosh, I have never, this is a particular crowd. That's a very smart question, and I just never thought about that. Well, one of my grandmothers was a very religious woman, and she was part of, Ethiopian Coptic Christian in Ethiopia. And I think she probably would have made something religious. And I think my other grandmother was illiterate. And I think about that a lot because of this thing that we take for granted, like writing, being very much like drawing. And so she lived in the countryside in Ethiopia. And I remember teaching her to write when I was 7 years old. Like, it was such a big thing for me. I was like, oh my gosh, how does she not know how to do this? But education wasn't what it was, especially for women at that time and in that place. So I would love to see what she made, because the idea of like watching her write was like watching a drawing, like how she was, it was very beautiful to me. It was very different than how I would have written. And so I think I just would have been very moved to see. I mean, maybe it wouldn't have been a drawing. Maybe it would have been, she was very humorous. So maybe she would have done like stand-up comedy. Like, I think she would have, like, that would have been her art form.
That's great. We have another question. They say, love your message and work. Have you ever worked with elementary school children?
I have. I feel like all artists who major in art in undergrad have like a rites of passage to be an after-school teacher. So I've definitely done that. And I commend everyone who is like actually an elementary school teacher right now, because it's right now, I mean, doing any kind of art with kids is like, with Zoom and everything like that, with hybrid learning and stuff like that, it's such a whole other ordeal. And parents have learned how to become elementary school teachers very quickly. And a lot of people probably Googled art projects for kids. But I do think that I have seen my work being used as teaching tools I just ran into somebody yesterday who told me he does he works from my work. He shows my work to his high school students, and they make projects based off of it. I know elementary school students have done things at museums that I've worked at, where there's like an education department, and they've made their own collage or headdress. So I think it's easy to translate like this kind of work in terms of like, they've all been exposed to books, so they can think of one form of documentation. And then the idea of making art, it's like, I think Jean-Michel Basquiat said it best. He was like, all art is basically, we're all trying to get back to remember how to be children again, because that is all the best art. And another friend of mine was just saying that he told his daughter asked, like, what do you do for a living? And he says, well, he's a professor of art. He says, I teach people how to draw. And his young daughter said, you mean that they forget how to draw? And so I love that idea that, kids are like, it's very intuitive for them. So yeah.
That's so beautiful, Helina. I feel like I want to just pause and bottle that moment for a second. That, yeah, as we age, we forget that it's just something that everyone can do, everyone is allowed to do. And, yeah, as a child, it is seen as something a priori. It's beautiful.
Let's see, a few other questions. Someone asked, how do you tackle the often unconscious trauma that may come to the surface when grappling with generational memorial stories?
Yeah. I mean, like, that's what's been happening, I think, in this country all around, right? Like, we're looking at everyone trying to reconcile the birth of this country. And I echo race healer Milagros Phillips, who I had studied with. I echo her in thinking and saying that, you know, the soul of this country is definitely something that people are fighting for, and we see it on all sides. And as a new American person, I have become deeply enriched in all of the politics in the US, even more so. I know it more than Ethiopian politics. So I can think of it as a new American, but I also can think of it as an Ethiopian person who is, in my genealogy, there is war and there is colonialism and the Italians sort of trying to occupy, Ethiopia. And that is something that I know that I'm making work about and thinking about. So I forgot the exact question, but it was about like
how tackling unconscious trauma that comes up when you're kind of facing these stories and
right.
Family stories, memorial stories.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's what my performance workshops are about. And I think we do it very, because I create this safe space where there's I always say safe because it's, what it really is safe, but we create space where there's no video camera, there's no photography. I mean, it's a space where people have cried, people have sort of released it somatically. And I think that that's something that I make space for in the work and the practice. It is emotional. The other thing is that because emotions are, stored in the body, and all of this that we're talking about it is so bodily, doing things that are bodily, like somatic exercises, I found have created like an unconscious sort of release where it's not all up in our head and we're not thinking through, like in talk therapy maybe, although that's important too. But I think, movement can be very rejuvenating. And so that's how I look at performance and somatic work. There's a few, I'm going to try to think of some to shout out some groups and communities that are doing somatic movement work, but I think generative somatics is one that I'm really interested in lately. They do projects around the country, and it's particularly around social justice, the intersections of social justice and somatic exercises. And as an artist, I've found that that's been they've provided the most depth in the practice. It's been about a 20-year organization. But yeah, I invite people to think about, movement as a way to, and in my study in epigenetics, movement and health and exercise and tending to yourself is one way to actually physically shift the biology, our biologies. And so that's something that we can look into just in terms of like care, right? Also communal care as a way to extend compassion to others who we know are going through so many different things. Even if they're very different from us, we can at least have that empathy for others. I think that's been an important part of my practice.
And kind of a nice segue, Patricia asks, can you say more about activating epigenetics?
Yeah, I am not a somatic therapist. I will just say that I am an artist, but from my readings and from my like movement groups and my study groups and all of the fun things that I do, because I'm not a licensed somatic therapist, I can't really advise on like a very technical level, but I can say that do the things that make you feel incredibly good as a gateway to feeling really even better. Like especially doing I love, another book I love is Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown, about really thinking about social justice work, not just as this thing that, can always be in this rut of anxiety and anger, but can it be about joy? And can you do this from a space of expansion, which can be, the things that make you happy in the moments that are also challenging, right? So like taking a deep breath is a very simple way to do that, grounding ourselves in our body. I love Alexis Pauline Gumby, another Black feminist scholar who writes beautifully about breath work and how that can be instrumental in social justice work. And also in work of deep interpersonal healing and personal healing.
All right. Well, I think those are just about all the questions, and we are almost at time. So thank you both. I will end, we have a comment from a viewer, Doris, who says, what a great program. It opens up our minds to other ways of presenting the family information that we've gathered. Thank you. So thank you both, Helina and Michelle, so much. So yes, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I do want to thank our speakers, Helina Metaferia and Michelle Millar Fisher, for sharing their time and for providing us with such an inspiring and personal afternoon as well. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at education@nehgs.org. You see the the email address on your screen. And if you're in the Boston area, be sure to check out the exhibition Helina Metaferia Generations on view at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, now until April 11th. So definitely check it out before it moves on. I also wanted to tell you about a few upcoming online events. So on February 17th, genealogist Megan Siekman will discuss strategies and resources for tracing African-American ancestors in New England. On February 28th, legal scholar, social historian, and best-selling author Linda Hirschman will discuss her latest book, The Color of Abolition: How a Printer, a Prophet, and a Contessa Moved a Nation. And then starting in March, we will be holding a 4-week online course on getting started in Jewish genealogy. And to learn more about those events and all of our upcoming events, please visit us at americanancestors.org/events. So thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to help keep these programs free and to create more free programs for you and for others. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit us at americanancestors.org. I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.